Okay, we were discussing earlier the question of whether STEM subjects are so much more valuable to society that they should receive a 100% tuition waiver, while all the non-STEM subjects in the humanities and social sciences are so useless to society that they shouldn't receive any kind of public support whatsoever. Yeah, I mean, this too is a familiar assumption. What we need is more STEM and less of everything else. But does it actually hold up to a moment's scrutiny? Can we in fact make even major public policy decisions without taking at least as much consideration of the kinds of issues studied by the humanities and social sciences? I mean, I think a very illuminating example here is in fact the case of higher education policy itself. We've given the task, to the Brown Review, a group of bankers and economists and vice chancellors and engineers, the assumption being that this is a technocratic problem and all we need is people who understand how money works and they can provide a sustainable higher education funding model for us. The fact that that policy has not generated anything like the consensus that was foreseen suggests that in fact there's something seriously lacking from the kind of considerations of the Brown Review. And all we need to do is run through the various higher education policy options and we can see that in every single one of them there is a very substantial moral factor in the equation that has to be taken into consideration if we are to generate a really consensual and sustainable higher education policy. One could argue that the most fair, the most equitable means of higher education funding is to waive tuition fees completely in order to remove any kind of financial obstacle and distribute access to higher education as equitably as possible. But on the other hand, one can argue, again on moral grounds, that it's unfair to ask people who haven't had the benefit of higher education to contribute as taxpayers to the higher education expenses of those who do get that benefit. One can argue on a very different model that the most equitable method of higher education funding is to charge each student the market value of the higher education which they receive. On the other hand, one can argue that this would distribute access to higher education in proportion to the individual's ability to pay rather than the individual's academic ability or potential, and therefore that it's a very unjust funding model. One could argue that as in trying to balance these two, as current higher education funding does, that no student should be required to pay tuition fees up front, but that the cost of higher education should be recouped after graduation either by an income contingent loan system or by some kind of graduate tax. But equally, one could argue on the other hand, it's very unfair to ask future graduates to pay back the full cost of their higher education expenses when we haven't asked previous generations of graduates to do that. Now, this is the general point. It doesn't matter which funding regime we consider, alongside the issue, the financial, the technocratic issue of how the numbers add up, there is a moral dimension, a moral equation about fairness, about equity, about justice between different sections of society and between successive generations. Now, as a matter of fact, there is a branch of, there's an academic discipline central to the humanities, focused precisely on how one goes about thinking rigorously about conditions of fairness and equity, moral considerations of this kind. Moral philosophy. Philosophy has at least as much to contribute to policy making in this particular area, higher education finance, as STEM subjects do. And if we want to have a robust and sustainable higher education policy, it's high time we got them fully involved as well.